And we're going to go to screen sharing. And we're going to continue with our discussion of metabolism that we talked about the other day. We will have our test on cells tomorrow. Since some of the people couldn't see the diffusion assignment and some of the people who could see it couldn't answer the questions and turn it in. I talked to IT and they helped me get that straightened out. At least I think you should be able to see it and turn it in now. I didn't want to do the test if there was a chance that you wouldn't be able to see it or wouldn't be able to turn it in. I thought that would be a bad thing to get started on. So we'll plan on doing that tomorrow at the beginning of class, and then at the end of class, we'll continue talking about metabolism. So let's look first at a chloroplast, because we're going to talk about a few metabolic pathways in some detail. And they're metabolic pathways that are really crucial in understanding how living organisms use energy, and really crucial for understanding how cells survive. And the first one we're going to talk about is a process called photosynthesis. And we're going to start kind of in the middle of our photosynthesis notes, because actually, I think this is a more logical place to begin. So photosynthesis takes place in an organelle called the chloroplast. Chloro means green. And when you look at a plant, it might look like the whole plant is green, but really the green is only in a small part of the chloroplast. There's just so much of that green, it makes the whole leaf look green that you're looking at. Sometimes it makes a stem look green. It depends on the type of plant that we're considering. So this is a chloroplast. Part of the front of it has been cut open so we can see the inside. So the white of the paper around the chloroplast would be the cytoplasm of a plant cell. Keep in mind that animal cells, like humans, we don't have chloroplasts in our cells. A chloroplast is similar to the mitochondrion or to the nucleus in the sense that it's separated from the cytoplasm, the white out here, by a double membrane system. So this darker green is the outer membrane. There's a lighter green. We can't see much of it because so much has been peeled back. This is the inner membrane. And then there's a little gap between them. Not a lot, but that little space between them is called the intermembrane space. Inter means between. So that's between the two membranes. Now, what we're going to be focusing on in photosynthesis is what happens inside the inner membrane. Excuse me. So if we look inside the inner membrane, there's a fluid in there, and it's called the stroma. And the stroma is kind of similar to the cytoplasm, or if you remember, inside the nucleus, there's nucleoplasm, or inside the mitochondrion, there's something called matrix. So this is a thick fluid. We've said it's kind of like a milkshake. It's mostly water molecules, but it's a lot of things dissolved with the water molecules. In the case of chloroplasts, there are a lot of proteins in the stroma. We'll see why later. Also inside this chloroplast are some little discs. And these little discs are called thylakoids. And these thylakoids are all connected to one another through little tubes and pipes. But when we look at these thylakoids, they're actually teeny tiny membrane-bound organelles. If you would look at these thylakoids, sometimes we see a stack of them, sometimes we see individual thylakoids. They kind of remind me of if at Easter, if you ever got those little foil covered chocolate coins, the foil around the outside of one of those would be the thylakoid membrane, the chocolate on the inside. That's called the lumen of the thylakoid. And lumen is a general term in biology. It just means the inside of something that's hollow. The inside part of the endoplasmic reticulum is sometimes called its lumen. So we have two main parts inside this inner membrane. we have our thylakoid, and we have our stroma. Now with the thylakoid, we're going to keep track of the difference between what happens in the thylakoid membrane and what happens in the thylakoid lumen. So let's go back to the top of our notes and begin thinking about photosynthesis. So the general equation for photosynthesis is that photosynthesis has two chemical reactants, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. We're going to combine those with 6 molecules of water. This is an endergonic or an endothermic reaction, so that means it absorbs energy from the environment. So the energy that is used in photosynthesis is sunlight. Well, there are some plants now that can use artificial lights like we have in our house, but before people came along, it was always sunlight. We're going to make two products. We're going to make glucose, and we're going to make oxygen. So if we think about where all these things come from and where they go to, plants get the carbon dioxide from the air around us. Carbon dioxide isn't much of the air, it's about 0.04% of the air. But that's where plants get their carbon dioxide. Plants that grow in water get carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water. Plants get their water from their roots. Their roots absorb water from the soil. Again, if you have a plant growing in a lake, there's water all around it. So we're getting some of our raw materials from the air and from the soil. We're going to make glucose. Now, what does the plant do with this glucose? Two things. All the molecules in the plant's body get built from this glucose. It uses this glucose to build the phospholipids in its plasma membrane. It uses this glucose to build the cellulose in its cell wall. It uses it to build the DNA in the chromosomes. It uses it to build all the proteins that make up the enzymes for the chemical reactions. So all the molecules in the plant's body come from this glucose. Now, the other thing it uses the glucose for is it uses it as a fuel. It burns this glucose. Remember, we talked about putting some sugar in a spoon the other day and burning it. It burns this glucose, and this provides it with the energy to do different activities. You might not think of plants as actually needing energy, but to build proteins, to put amino acids together and assemble them into proteins, that takes energy. So plants do a lot of things that require energy. And plants also make some oxygen in this process. Plants use a little bit of the oxygen they make, but plants make so much oxygen in photosynthesis that there's a surplus. And they just release all that surplus into the air, which is good for us because that's the oxygen that we breathe. The oxygen that you breathe, that you're breathing right now, originally was produced by a plant in photosynthesis. Or there are a few other organisms that can carry out photosynthesis. Anything that can do photosynthesis is called an autotroph. Auto means self, troph means feed. So autotrophs can feed themselves. Why? Because they can make nutrients like glucose out of carbon dioxide and water. So they can feed themselves. Besides plants, there are a couple of other organisms that are autotrophs. There are some bacteria that carry out photosynthesis, and there are some things that we call algae that carry out photosynthesis. You might have thought that algae are plants, and they're similar in some ways, mostly the fact that they carry out photosynthesis, but they don't have other characteristics that would make us group them with plants. Now, if we look at organisms like ourselves, animals and fungi and other types of things, a lot of organisms like us are heterotrophs. Hetero means other, think of heterosexual. Heterotrophs get their food from others. So basically, we get our nutrients. We can't make them from scratch like a plant does. If you were an autotroph, you could go out, lay on your front lawn, and save your lunch money today. But you have to eat organic molecules that other organisms have made. So you could eat a hamburger, you could eat another heterotroph, or you could have a salad. You could eat nutrients from an autotroph. Notice if you eat a heterotroph, if you eat a cow and you go back, that cow ate some grass. So ultimately, for heterotrophs, all the food that they ate started out in autotrophs. So without autotrophs, we wouldn't be here. They could survive without us. We couldn't survive without them. Well, photosynthesis is a metabolic pathway. Remember what we said the other day, there are very few metabolic reactions that happen in an isolated fashion in living cells. So this is a metabolic pathway. If we look at the equation, remember what we said to start with. Since the reactants are absorbing energy and storing it in chemical bonds in the products, especially in glucose, but even a little bit in oxygen. Since the reactants are absorbing energy, this is an endothermic or an endergonic pathway. We're adding energy in. We're also taking small molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and combining them into a bigger molecule, glucose. So this is an anabolic reaction. And as we'll see later, a lot of the reactions that occur when we take small molecules and combine them into bigger molecules, remember these are a type of reaction that we call dehydration synthesis reactions. So when we think photosynthesis, we want to think endergonic or endothermic, whichever term you prefer. We want to think it's anabolic, and we want to think that it's an example of dehydration synthesis within this pathway. And that's going to be true for almost any reaction pathway where we build bigger molecules from smaller molecules. So we want to keep that in mind. When we look at photosynthesis, there are four main pathways, and we can divide them into two categories. There are three pathways that are part of what we call the light-dependent, should be reactions, plural. And these include cyclic photophosphorylation, a really long name, don't let it psych you out. Photo means light. Phosphorylation means you're going to add a phosphate group to something. So this means we're going to use the energy from light to add a phosphate to something. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to add a phosphate group to ADP, and we're going to convert it to ATP. And cyclic, remember when we talked about metabolic pathways the other day, this is a cyclic metabolic pathway. And in a cyclic metabolic pathway, remember what we said? The last product is the same chemical as the first reactant. So we start out with something, and at the end of the pathway, we regenerate it. We make it over again. So this allows us to keep doing this over and over. There's also a different version called non-cyclic photophosphorylation. And non-cyclic photophosphorylation also uses the sunlight to add a phosphate group to ADP and change it into ATP, but it makes one other thing. It makes NADPH. And this is where the oxygen is made. Now there's a third process that's part of the light-dependent reactions called chemiosmosis. So remember when we talked about diffusion, we talked about osmosis in connection with that. And we said osmosis is really just the diffusion of water across a membrane. So this is going to have something to do with the diffusion of water. So we want to keep this in mind. And this is actually the metabolic pathway that makes the ATP. Now, these light-dependent reactions, and they're sometimes just called the light reactions, these light-dependent reactions happen in the thylakoid membrane. So we'll see later, we're going to be looking at a bunch of molecules that are in the membrane. And we're going to need really two inputs to the light-dependent reactions. This is where water comes in. If we go back to the top, remember water was one of our reactants. Well, this is where the water is used, and this is where we need sunlight. Duh, light-dependent reactions, makes sense. This is where we need sunlight. We're going to make a product, oxygen. So notice, like usual, things that are at the beginning of an arrow are reactants. Things that are at the point of an arrow are products. Now, we're also going to need 3 more reactants, but we'll talk about them later because they're a little bit different than either water or light. We're going to need NADP with a positive charge, and we're going to need ADP and phosphate. Now, besides oxygen, we're going to make 2 more products. During the light-dependent reactions, remember what we just said, we're going to phosphorylate ADP. We're going to add a phosphate group to it. So ADP, remember the DP is diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups. When we add a 3rd one, we get ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So notice the ATP is at the tip of an arrow here. It's a product of the light-dependent reactions. And we're going to take these hydrogens that started out on water, and we're going to add them to NADP+. We're going to turn it into NADPH. Now, the second set of reactions is the light-independent reactions, which are often called the Calvin cycle, after the scientist who did most of the early work on the biochemistry. He actually worked with 2 other scientists. I don't know why their names aren't on this. For the light-independent reactions are the Calvin cycle. There's one main reactant that we can see in the equation, CO2. So again, if we go back to our equation, CO2 is one of the reactants. And we make one main product, sugar, which is our glucose. But notice we also make some other products. Think about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has the formula CO2. If we look at glucose, glucose is C6H12O6. So if we don't do much else, and we just think about a very simple comparison between the formula for carbon dioxide and glucose, glucose has something that carbon dioxide doesn't, hydrogen atoms. Where does it get those hydrogen atoms? From this NADPH that we made over here in the light-dependent reactions. And we're going to transfer those hydrogen atoms from NADPH. We're going to put them on carbon dioxide. And as we do that, we're going to convert carbon dioxide into glucose. But it takes energy to move those atoms from NADPH to glucose. Where are we going to get the energy? By breaking down ATP. So when we take the hydrogens off NADPH, we just have NAD plus left. It goes back to the light-dependent reactions to pick up more hydrogens. So notice the NAD plus and the NADPH really just cycle back and forth. And this is why they're not in the equation up here. We don't see any ATP, we don't see any inorganic phosphate, any ADP, any NADPH. Why don't we see them? Because we make an NADPH and then we use one up. Remember when we first started talking about chemical reactions, we said, if you have something as a reactant and a product, if it's on both sides of the equation, you can cancel it like a math problem. So ATP is a product. It gets made in the light-dependent reactions. Then it's a reactant. It gets broken down in the light-independent reactions. So we don't see any of these in the final equation for ATP. For photosynthesis, we just see the water and the carbon dioxide. We just see the oxygen and the glucose, the sugar. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, before we can think about photosynthesis, we have to talk about light a little bit and what some of the properties of light are, because the properties of light are very important for photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plants absorb some of the solar energy, some of the light, and that's what provides the energy for photosynthesis. Well, if we look at light, light is a type of what we call electromagnetic radiation. And yes, electricity is actually part of this, and magnetism is part of this. And when we look at electromagnetic radiation, it has two properties. It has the wavelength, and the wavelength is the distance from the peak of one of these waves to the next wave. And wavelengths differ from a tiny fraction of a second, fraction of an inch, to something that's the length of a football field. Now, besides wavelength, the other thing we have is frequency. How many of these waves pass by, you could think of an observer looking at them in a given time. Notice that when wavelength is high, frequency is low. They don't show frequency on here. That's because the higher the frequency, the higher the energy. So the frequency is actually higher towards the left end, the same end where energy is higher. The wavelength is higher towards the right end. Now, there are all different sorts of electromagnetic radiation. There are gamma rays, that's what turned Bruce Banner into the Hulk. There are X-rays, like we might use in a medical procedure. There's what we call ultraviolet light. And we can't see ultraviolet light, but there are some animals, like most bees and a lot of other insects, can actually see ultraviolet light. Then there's visible light. And visible light gets its name because this is basically the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. Notice it's not what all animals can see. Remember, I just mentioned bees. If you go to the other end, we have infrared light. And again, people can't really see this, but there are some animals, there are a number of snakes that can see infrared light. Basically, if your body temperature is above what's called absolute zero, you give off infrared light. So there are a lot of snakes that can track their prey by seeing infrared light. A lot of times infrared cameras are used in science fiction movies. If you've ever seen one of those science fiction movies where people's bodies are different colors, blue, white, green, red, yellow, it could be special effects, but a lot of times it's just something that's photographed with an infrared camera. So we can see what the camera shows us, but we can't see infrared light itself. And then they're called radio waves, but it's actually radio waves, TV waves, FM waves, AM waves, all sorts of different waves on the high wavelength frequency. Now, if we look at visible light, we say that white light is composed of all the colors of the spectrum. And the spectrum are all the different colors of visible light that we can see. Usually we start at the red end of the spectrum, and the colors are described as red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Or they're often abbreviated as a kind of a name, Roy G. Biv. These are the colors that people can see. Now, our eyes aren't very good at distinguishing indigo from violet, and depending on certain genetic characteristics, some people are colorblind and can't see certain colors. They appear as kind of gray. You can take a little piece of glass called a prism, and you can take ordinary white light coming from something like a flashlight with a very narrow beam, and if you pass it through the prism, because of the way that the glass in the prism is bent, it will separate that light into the colors of the spectrum. Now, even without a prism, you can see spectrum sometimes. If you've ever gone to a store, you park in the parking lot and there's a little spot of oil in the in the parking lot that leaked from somebody's car. A lot of times when the oil reflects the sunlight, you can see the colors of the spectrum in it. Or this is what you're seeing when light from the sun passes through water and creates something that we call a rainbow. That's really the spectrum. Now, sometimes it's hard to see all the colors in a spectrum, but the next time you look at a rainbow, if you notice, you don't really have red and then blue and then yellow. The colors are always in this order. Sometimes there are some colors missing depending on how the spectrum is created, but we can't just rearrange the colors. They're always in this sequence. So these are the basic colors that people can see. As I say, some animals can see beyond this, and it depends on how you look at it, I suppose. But there are some animals like bats and duck-billed platypuses and some other animals that can see by using their sense of hearing. There are some animals that emit sound waves, and then when the waves echo back to them, when they bounce back, they can use that to navigate. Now, when we look at light, what we want to keep in mind is the three things that could happen when light strikes an object. And there are really only three possibilities. Light can be reflected off of the object. So think of what happens when you look in a mirror. The image that you're seeing in the mirror is light that's reflected off the mirror. And notice, think about a mirror, it's pretty obvious. We can see light that's reflected. Another possibility is light can be transmitted. And transmitted light just goes completely through an object. Transmitted light's also visible. A good example of this is what you see when you look at a window. The reason you can see the other side is because light is transmitted through the window. And finally, there's a third possibility. Light can be absorbed when it hits an object. Now, light that's absorbed stays in the object. And since it stays in the object, it can't be seen because it's in the object. And it's only light that's absorbed that an object actually uses. So this means if you think about plants, most plant leaves are green. So that means this is being reflected. Plants aren't transparent. The light isn't being transmitted. It's not going through them. So if they're reflecting green light, what does that tell us? They're not really using green light very much for photosynthesis. If we look at green, if we go back to our spectrum, green is kind of in the middle of the visible spectrum. Plants are mostly using things towards the red end of the spectrum for photosynthesis, or towards the blue-purple end for photosynthesis. They're not using green light for photosynthesis. Now we'll see they do use some light because some of the green light, because it would be wasteful to just have all of that reflect. So let's think about what we have in our thylakoid membrane. And one of the main things that we have are some things called pigment molecules. And especially if you've had an art class, you know that pigments are things that are colored. And pigment molecules absorb solar energy. And these pigment molecules are going to be the very beginning of the light-dependent reaction. Now, some pigments are better than others. So as a result, there are all sorts of pigment molecules that are different colors. We're going to mostly talk about pigments called chlorophylls. Chloro means green, phyll means leaf. So this is literally the chemical that makes leaves green. Now there are different types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, there's other chlorophylls. And if you would look at the different chlorophylls, some of them are lighter greens, some of them are darker greens. And this actually means that they're absorbing slightly different wavelengths of light and reflecting slightly different wavelengths of light. There's a whole group of chemicals called carotenoids. And carotenoids can be yellow, they can be orange, they can be red. They actually get their name from a compound that gives carrots their colors. There's another color called fucoxanthins, and fucoxanthins are brown, and fucoxanthins are pigment molecules that are found in a lot of what we call seaweeds. So if you've ever been, in Lake Michigan, or if you've ever been in an ocean, some of the seaweed that you see floating around or gets on your arm looks brown, and you think it's all yucky and it's dead, and actually it's supposed to be brown. Not everything that's photosynthetic is red. And there's another type of pigment called phycobilins, and phycobilins are actually kind of reds like some of the carotenoids, but they're only found in a few types of bacteria that are photosynthetic. So if we had a red color in a plant, it would be from a carotenoid. If we had it in a bacteria, it would be from a phycobilin. So slight difference. Now, pigment molecules don't occur by themselves. If we look at pigment molecules, they're organized into some things called photosystems. And photosystems are found in the thylakoid membrane. So remember, we just said these pigment molecules absorbing sunlight is the beginning of the light-dependent reactions. So the light-dependent reactions are going to happen in the thylakoid membrane. And a photosystem is a system of about 100 pigment molecules. The pigment molecules are the important part, but there's actually kind of a framework of proteins and lipids that they're attached to. And there's always two molecules of chlorophyll A that make up something that we call the reaction center. And you can tell by the name, the reaction center is going to be crucial in terms of how photosynthesis works. All the other pigment molecules, so the other 98 or so, make up something called an antenna complex. So the antenna complex works like the antenna in the old days that people used to have on their house to get TV reception. The antenna complexes are going to collect solar energy, and once they collect it, they're going to transfer it to the reaction center. And they're going to do this by some of those oxidation reduction reactions that we talked about the other day. And there's really only two photosystems in plants. There's one called photosystem 2, which is often abbreviated as just photosystem 1, PS1, and it's sometimes called P700 because it absorbs light of wavelength 700 nanometers best. So if we go back up here, 700 nanometers is right at kind of the transition between orange and red. Now, there's a second photosystem, photosystem 2, which is abbreviated as PS2, which is P680. And it absorbs light of wavelength 680 nanometers best, which is just a little closer to the orange side. So what do these photosystems do? First, they trap energy in a molecule. When light hits a plant, light is actually carried in little packages called photons. A photon is kind of like an electron. A photon of light hits one of these pigment molecules in the antenna complex. So here's a diagram of a photosystem. This dark green and this purple molecule are the two molecules of chlorophyll A that make up the reaction center. So here's a photon of light. All these lighter green molecules are the pigment molecules that make up the antenna complex. And when light is hitting the plant, one of the atoms in the pigment molecule, an electron, absorbs some of the solar energy. And when the electron absorbs some of the solar energy, it passes that energy to an electron in the next pigment molecule. And that passes it to an electron in the next pigment molecule. And that passes it to an electron in the next pigment molecule, until finally it gets to the first chlorophyll A in the reaction center. Now, keep in mind, when the electron gets a little bit of energy and it transfers this energy through other electrons and other pigment molecules, there's a little bit of energy lost at each transfer. Remember what we talked about earlier with the laws of thermodynamics. No transfer of energy is 100% efficient. So we lose a little bit of energy at each spot. But when this first chlorophyll A molecule in the reaction center gets this extra energy, it passes an electron to what's called the primary electron acceptor. And the primary electron acceptor is just the second molecule of chlorophyll A. So this purple square and this dark green circle are both chlorophyll A. Those are the two chlorophyll A molecules of the reaction center. Now, when the electron in the primary electron acceptor, when it gets there, the next thing that happens is it's going to basically jump out of this molecule. So what we want to look at now is how it can jump out of this molecule and make ATP and NADPH. So are there any questions so far about photosynthesis? Okay, we're going to stop screen sharing for a moment.